Well, thank you very much, Rev Morty. I enjoyed that, and I am happy to be here. I was a student at RTC in 2016 to 2017, and hopefully this will be interesting. I will try to answer any questions that people might have in the chat, but otherwise, I guess let's go. What I'll be discussing today in the limited time that we have is debt servitude in the ancient Near East. It's a big topic. A lot of people have written whole books on specifically debt servitude and debt slavery in Torah, the ancient Near East as a whole, comparison between the two. What I'd like to do now is focus on one specific example and how we can analyze ancient Near Eastern content and then responsibly use that to contextualize Torah and some of the material in Torah. So specifically, we'll be using some of the material from Amar, which is a late Bronze Age city that we'll be discussing shortly. Before we do that, I want to briefly discuss why it's worthwhile to contextualize debt servitude in Tanakh with ancient Near Eastern material. The first and most important thing is probably that legal institutions vary over time quite significantly. And so if we're looking at the legal institutions for slavery or debt servitude in the time of the Reformation, that's very different than the institution of slavery and debt servitude in the British Empire and in the United States in the lead up to the Civil War. And that's also very different than the period of the Mishnah and the Gemara or the Hellenistic period in the Second Temple, in Second Temple context, or even before them. And so having that cultural context for how institutions operated can be very useful in getting in developing a greater appreciation for the nuances of the Torah text and its presentation, especially on morally significant topics such as questions of servitude and slavery. And the other thing that's worth noting is that even though there's a significant amount of variation in legal institutions across the ancient Near East, and we'll see some of that. And even though we couldn't expect that the Torah's presentation of or understanding of slavery or debt servitude will be the same as other ancient Near Eastern law codes, there is still a significant amount of socio-legal context that is shared across the ancient Near East, across well over 1,000 years, and this remains largely consistent. And so if we can identify these shared socio-legal features, that can help contextualize Torah, even if the nuances of each particular law code differ. And I think one of the best examples of this is that Torah assumes the existence of the institution of marriage and divorce. It regulates some of those details, and it will mention divorce in particular in certain contexts, but it never legislates divorce. Right? It doesn't tell you this is how divorce operates. It never legislates marriage and says this is how marriage operates. It's extensive discussion in the Mishnah Gemara on precisely those issues. And so the reason why it can just assume those legal institutions is because it's operating in that ancient Eastern legal milieu, and everybody understands how, roughly speaking, the contours of divorce and marriage operate. And that's true for other legal institutions as well. I'd also say that when we're comparing Torah to other ancient Eastern material, it's important to do that responsibly. So there can be parallelomania where people sort of elide any distinctions between Torah and ancient Near Eastern comparative material because they really want everything to match. And then they might go further and suggest a particular direction of reliance or the historical context in which the relationship between Torah and whatever other text may have developed. And often that can be irresponsible. So when we're looking for elements of broader sociocultural production in the ancient Near East, it's a much more methodologically conservative position than trying to argue for the reliance of any one text on another text. So with that, let's begin and see what we can get out of this very specific example from Amar. And to do that, we need to take a brief detour into some of the terminology for legal institutions for debt servitude and slavery. And I'll note the reason why I'm using the term debt servitude is because not all individuals uh, who were servants or had some type of debt relationship with a creditor were enslaved. Slavery was a separate legal institution. There are all sorts of debates about the meaning of slavery and its applicability in the ancient Near East, but there were different legal categories for those who were chattel slaves versus debt slaves or indentured debt servants. And so I want to preserve that distinction. Uh, some of the terminology that occurs is kishatum. This occurs in the Code of Hammurabi. This is the area that people look to for something akin to debt servitude, as in Exodus 21 with the 7-year cycle. It's a 3-year cycle in the context of Hammurabi. This is a case, I think, where people go a little bit too far with the parallels. I think the legal institutions differ quite considerably, but there are institutions where a head of household can give his family members to a creditor or to somebody else for a limited period of time make to pay back the principal on an outstanding loan that is either going into default or has gone into default. You also have other institutions of debt servitude called imelutu, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. And the Amelutu was a particular type of debt relationship that I think will help contextualize some of the factors, economic and social factors that go into the presentation of slavery in Exodus 21, 2-6. You've got the anti-credit pledge. This is a very common institution. There are lots of terms for it. Mazazan Newton is a common one. And in this case, instead of paying interest on a loan, an individual gives over their property or a family member, and use of that property or family member serves in place of receiving interest on a loan. That can be perpetual, effectively, where an individual operates as a debt servant and continue to pay off the interest on this outstanding balance without ever addressing the principal of the loan. And then you have andararum. This may be familiar to people because it's parallel to dror in Torah. So it's this freedom declaration. The most famous one is from Hammurabi's several times a great grandson, but there are others. And in this case, at least specific categories of slaves are freed from their slavery. Okay. So now we can delve into Amor and what it can tell us about these institutions and about foreign institutions. Amar is a site that's in northwest Syria. It's destroyed in 1187. The one of the collapse. In the 1980s, we have the publication of texts from Amar, over 1,000 texts. In fact, many of them are from private homes, which can give different types of insights than if they're from royal households. And there are many legal and ritual texts that have relevance to contextualizing Torah. We also don't have very many texts and documents from the Late Bronze Age. So Amar is a very valuable source of legal and social material for this period. So what can these texts from Amar tell us? Specifically, the Amelutu text from Amar. Amelutu texts have a particular formula we see consistently, because A is the Amelutu of B for some amount of shekels of silver. There's an outstanding loan, often that's converted into this debt service because the debtor, the Amelutu, is unable to pay their outstanding loan. Now, there are two types of Amelutu contracts, those with the Palafu formula and those without. Palafu formula requires some additional service to a creditor above and beyond what they might have been required to do to pay their debt. And so in this case, a palaco service would mean that the debtor has to serve the creditors, generally both the husband and wife, until the end of their lives. And only at that point are they freed from this service to their creditors. And that's potentially a very extended service period. You don't know exactly how long it will last. And it's actually quite interesting that sometimes it's clear that the creditors have children, And so perhaps there are concerns that their children aren't going to take care of them in their old age, and so they're providing for an alternative means of ensuring that they're cared for. In any case, though, we might have expected that this type of open-ended service for the rest of the creditor's life would be associated with particularly large debts, because who would want to sign up for this type of perpetual servitude if it were not for this type of large debt? Well, we find that that's actually not the case. In many cases, the Amelutu contracts with the Palahu service have smaller debt amounts than the other Amelutu contracts. So the question is, why would somebody agree to Palahu service? And the answer is, for the Amelutu contracts that don't have Palahu, they have to transfer additional security to their creditor to ensure that uh, they won't default on their loan, or at least the creditor can recover some of the outstanding costs. So the Amelutu without the Palahu end up transferring pretty much all of their real property, including their land and their family, into control of the creditor. And this is a last-ditch attempt to prevent defaulting on their debt and then potentially being enslaved. Now, in contrast, the Amelutu contracts with the Palahu service are single men, so far as we can tell. And the Amelutu contracts with this service provide for the marriage of the debtor. And in some cases, actually, the creditor will provide a dowry for the future wife. We'll see a case later on where it's the daughter of a creditor who's married to the debtor, although in this case it was an adopted daughter, so it may have been a legal fiction of some sort. But there are benefits to this type of perpetual service. The debtor is probably not a very attractive husband. They can't provide for their family. They don't have real assets. And so even though they are going into this perpetual servitude, they have a guarantee of food and housing, and then their marriage is facilitated by this creditor. So in some contexts, that can be an attractive offer. Let's take a closer look at this case. It's called QV052. It's a particular tablet. QV051 is where the daughter is adopted into the creditor's household. And here we have the Amelutu contract with the Palahu formula. And here are some selections. In this case, what we have is Fishmia, who is the debtor, can take the hand of his wife and children and go wherever he pleases if he fulfills the term of service of his contract. However, if the creditor says to the debtor, return my silver and leave my house, so the creditor is in violation of the contractual agreement, he needs to give the debtor a certain number of shekels, and the debtor is allowed to take the hand of his wife and children and go wherever he pleases. And then likewise, if the debtor is the one who violates the contract, he has to pay a penalty amount, a significant 120 shekels of silver, and then significantly, the debtor has no right to take his wife and children with him. And what I'd like to argue is that this reflects a broader ancient Near Eastern legal institution where creditors often facilitated the marriage of the debtors in their household. It was beneficial to the debtors. It was potentially beneficial to the creditors as well. And in normal circumstances, when the debtor leaves that household, they were not able to take their family and children with them. And if you're familiar at all with the beginning of Mikvatim, this would sound very familiar to you, because here we have very explicit instructions that if a man enters household as a slave single, he leaves single. And if he's given a wife and they have children, the wife and children do not leave slavery. I think many people have been confused by this. Many people have lots of moral qualms. I'm not necessarily here to answer that, but I do hope to contextualize it in this broader ancient Eastern context. I do think that this was a common institution and an assumption as to how debtors operated in creditors' households. I think it can also give us some insight into the decision of a slave to stay with their master and wife and children and not go free and then go through this ritual where his ear is pierced. In this context, I'd argue that there are parallels to the Palahu service. With the Amelutu, this is a debtor who is not an attractive husband because he can't provide for his family and is in debt. And in exchange for service for the rest of the creditor's life, he's able to marry and have children. And then through this service is able to go free. Likewise, in the context of the slave at the beginning of the 13, you have somebody who receives a wife and has children as part of this debtor-creditor relationship, and then is interested in remaining with his family. And I think this is the part that is speculative. Uh, it depends on how we read the olam, you know, the end of verse 6, uh, for life or forever. At Elephantine, the olam generally means over the course of a person's life. So a contract can say le olam and your children after you. So obviously it doesn't refer to eternity, it refers to the span of an individual's life who's mentioned in this lawsuit or contract. And the question is, whose life? Is it the life of the creditor or the life of the debtor? If we are to draw parallels to the Palafu service, then I'd argue that we could read this as the life of the creditor and that he goes free after that point. It's not perpetual servitude for the totality of the life of this debtor. And then again, if we are to draw parallels to Palafu service, it's possible that his wife and children leave with him, just as when the Palafu service is finished, when those creditors pass away, the debtor is able to take his wife and children with him. And I think this type of context has significant explanatory capability in illustrating what the factors are that cause a debtor to receive a wife and have children, why they might be interested in that, and then why they might want to stay with their master and do this extended service rather than leaving. So, to summarize what we've done here, Halachic formulae are part of a broader ancient Near Eastern legal milieu where the creditor often facilitates a debtor's marriage, potentially even adopts them into the family. Normally, in the ancient Near East, a debtor would not be able to leave servitude with their family. And again, this is also true in Torah, in Mishpatim. However, at Amar and elsewhere, we have this institution that is created to resolve these social and legal issues that come from separating the debtor from his wife and children. And the Palafu service is one way to do that because they can do extended service and end up leaving with their family. The Torah in the Sfatim, I think, offers potentially an alternative means of resolving that tension. If Leolam refers to the life of the creditor, then you might suggest that the debtor leaves with their family after the death of the creditor. In any case, so even if that's not true, uh, we have contextualized one particular example of debt servitude and slavery in Torah with other ancient Near Eastern legal material. And there's a lot more to be done here, and there are many other parallels in other cases. But my hope is to offer an example of how being familiar with ancient Near Eastern material can potentially enrich our understanding of the biblical text, and then allow us to evaluate the degree of similarity or difference between the two. It's not necessarily that a familiarity with ancient Near Eastern material means that the Torah offers uh, identical presentations, but we can be more sensitive to areas where it does not do so when we engage with the ancient Near Eastern material that's available to us. Thank you. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, well, in that case,
Wait,
thank you
can I
very
ask a
much.
question? How
Well,
you doing? I mean, would you say there's any particular one ancient law book that is most similar to the Torah of the ones that you quoted? Because you quoted quite a few. Right? Meaning, is the Torah familiar with multiple ones, or is there one that you would think might be more might have been more parallel at the time?
so there are scholars who've tried to argue for close parallels to the Code of Hammurabi or the Code of Asnuna, and I don't think that either of them are right. At the very least, the Torah is engaging with material that is in both codes. and the structure of the Torah's presentation in some cases parallels the Sunnah more closely, in some cases parallels Hammurabi more closely. I don't think that means that Torah is necessarily directly familiar with them. It's very possible that these cases are circulating as part of the socio-legal milieu in the ancient Near East, and Torah is interpreting that in a different way. But scholars who've tried to argue specifically for reliance on Hammurabi, I think, have failed. And same thing with Sunnah. Those two would be the most useful law codes for people who want to look at a code specifically to contextualize Torah material. But part of the problem is there's a large amount of scholarly debate on the degree to which law codes were actualized and law codes were actually statutory law in the ancient Near East rather than idealized law or idealized example of morality or scribal exercises. And so looking at actual cases, contracts, lawsuits, things like that, can also be illustrative of how law was actually practiced and how the judicial system actually functioned. Does that answer your question?
I mean, until you write your doctorate and are more precise, yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case, thank you very much. I hope that this was interesting and have a good day.